Welcome back. I'm Philippe. This is Photography and Walking, a podcast about images, movement, memory, and the places where they meet. Today we walk the streets of Likasi in the Democratic Republic of Congo through the quiet and insistent vision of artist Sami Baloji. I still remember the moment, back in 2009 at Le Mois de la Photo in Montreal, when I first encountered Sami Baloji's panoramic series, Vues de Likasi. I wasn't expecting it, and I certainly wasn't prepared for how quietly powerful it would be. These weren't monumental images in the usual sense. No theatrical lighting, no sweeping vistas. Just a long frieze of photographs sequenced together street by street, showing the quiet, ordinary architecture of a city in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Strung together like a film reel, flattened out, evoking an unrolled horizontal scroll. But it stayed with me. The more I looked, the more I realized how densely layered these pictures were, not just visually, but historically, socially, politically. At the time, the Biennale's curator, Gaël Morel, had built the edition around the idea of staging and the mechanisms behind photography. But what struck me in Baloji's work was something more understated, a kind of walking, a kind of wandering with a camera. It wasn't about staging in the theatrical sense. It was about presence, about tracing a line across the city, about documenting what remains. This episode steps into terrain where photography and walking meet histories. Plural, because it's never just one history. With Vues de Likasi, Baloji draws out the deep tensions and visible residues of colonialism in a city that still bears the architecture and infrastructure of Belgian occupation. His photographs are deadpan, frontal, steady. No dramatic angles or manipulations, just the facts, or at least the visible surfaces. In a way, he reconstructs the streets of Likasi, photograph by photograph. The buildings are mostly bland, boxy, left over from the colonial and early industrial periods. Their function is often unclear. Some might be residences, other workshops or offices, but they all carry a similar look. Concrete walls, metal windows, signs of decay and reuse. The effect is cumulative. As you follow the strip of photos, you start to feel a rhythm, not a visual crescendo, but a kind of visual walking, a measured, deliberate, step by step. You could argue that, from a photohistorical perspective, the images echo an old typological impulse, something you might associate with the Becker's documentation of industrial structures in Europe, or with certain strains of conceptual photography. But Baloji's concerns are different. His panoramas document not just architecture, but a kind of haunting. The ways in which colonial violence and resource extraction have shaped and continue to shape Congolese life. So, in some ways, Baloji's method is a kind of resistance. He walks, he observes, he records. But it's not neutral. His walking is political. His camera is slow, steady, insistent. Vues de Likasi doesn't shout, but it refuses to look away. Baloji grew up in Katanga province, an area rich in minerals and long exploited for its copper and cobalt. He was acutely aware of how colonialism worked not only through violence, but through architecture, planning, and control of land. Likasi, formerly known as Jadoville under Belgian rule, was one of the key industrial cities in that extractive system. So when Baloji photographs these streets, he's not just documenting buildings. He's confronting a landscape shaped by exploitation. He's retracing the geography of resource extraction, how bodies and labor were directed, how capital flowed, how space was regulated. Power often moves fast, conquering, erasing, rewriting. But Baloji's images don't. They walk, street by street, and in walking with them, we practice a different kind of looking, deliberate, attentive, and ideally unwilling to gloss over what's uncomfortable. There's a term that resonates here, necropolitics. Coined by the Cameroonian historian and political theorist Akile Membe, it describes the way certain systems, especially colonial or authoritarian ones, exert power, not just over life, over death, deciding who matters and who doesn't, who lives, who's protected, and who's disposable. In Baloji's photographs, you don't see violence directly, but it's there, in the peeling paint, in the space between people, in the eerie calm of the streets. It is latent, embedded, archived in the photos. What fascinates me about Vues de Likasi is how it avoids spectacle. It doesn't try to dramatize pain or exoticize poverty. Instead, it presents us with a pared-down, almost documentary format that juxtaposes the city's colonial vestiges with its current-day reality. Some absences are visible, like ruins or empty streets. Others are harder to see, disappeared bodies, erased histories, ghost infrastructures. Baloji's images gesture towards both. The color photos, sometimes washed out by harsh sunlight, echo the heat, the dust, the passage of time. Strips of old buildings, most painted white against the sun, some marked with commercial signage. People appear alone or in small groups, standing, walking, going about daily life. There's no digital gloss, no cinematic flourish. Just the straightforward record of buildings that were never meant to be seen as monuments, but which now stand as markers of a long and complicated past. And yet, it's not frozen. There's movement. Yes, in some of the images themselves, but especially in how they're assembled, how they unfold horizontally, like a slow walk across town. Each photo abuts the next, but not seamlessly. The difference in size, exposure, and vantage point creates visual hiccups. And these breaks, these gaps, act almost like punctuation. They mark a step. They give the viewer a beat to register, to breathe, and to question. But there's something else happening here too. A reflection on mimicry. The key voice in post-colonial theory, Homi Bhabha, in The Location of Culture, writes about the colonial subject being pressured to mimic the colonizer. To be, as he puts it, almost the same but not quite. That mimicry was never meant to grant equality. It was a strategy of control, a way to reinforce difference while demanding resemblance. In Baloji's photographs, we see architectural mimicry. Colonial buildings that imitate European design, now reoccupied, repurposed, sometimes crumbling. The structures echo a past that tried to impose itself as permanent. But permanence is fragile. What survives is not always what was intended. So Bhabha's idea of mimicry, both resemblance and menace, helped me to see how traces of colonial power can persist in form, even when the structures themselves have changed. I started to think about the echoes of that dynamic closer to home, in Montreal. And these echoes reminded me of a project I did years ago, a photographic walk around the island of Montreal. I shot over 5,500 black and white images, all facing across the street, building a continuous panoramic strip that traced the island's edge. In fact, this was the project that sparked my deeper creative and intellectual path with photography and walking. I was thinking about only walking in photos. Baloji's work, though made in a very different context, resonates deeply. Both projects use walking and photography not as tools of mastery, but as forms of encounter, of paying attention. What stands out to me most in Vues de Likasi is its refusal to over-explain. Baloji doesn't add text or titles to each photograph. He lets the work speak for itself, quietly but insistently. You get the sense that this is a record that needed to be made, not to convince, but to witness. And that witnessing is powerful. It pushes back against the idea that post-colonial African cities exist only in relation to crisis or chaos. It asks us to look, to really look, not for drama, but for the layers of history, memory, and endurance that are embedded in the everyday. There's a kind of generosity in that, and a kind of warning. Because if we look too quickly, we'll miss the point. The power of Baloji's work lies in its pace. It makes us slow down. Vues de Likasi invites us to look closely at what's been left, and what that leftover tells us. That was episode 4 of Photography and Walking. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can help by sharing it with a friend. For images, references, and more, visit photographyandwalking.com. Thanks for walking with me, and see you next time when we'll be walking between Paris and Venice.